The Necromancer has two of the safest builds for making your way through the end of hell difficulty, even on hardcore, and those are the Summoner and the Bonemancer. Today we're going to favor the active players since I realized I had not refreshed the Bone Guide for, well, almost a year at this point, despite the fact that he is my preferred solo self-found build and heck, one of my favorite season starters since I preferred finding the new stuff to experiment with rather than racing to 99. Though, since he has Corpse Explosion and Curses, he can be pretty handy for that too. Now, in terms of absolute endgame potency, he's a generic B-tier build that can do anything, but isn't going to compete with the more overpowered builds like the Hammered-In or the Blizzard Sorceress, and usually chills as Mr. Fire support in most groups by dipping a bit heavier into Curses than the solo version who dips mostly into Bone. But that said, for early game and solo self-found, especially on hardcore, he's one of the best and cheapest builds to get rolling. This is because his skill set, while definitely point hungry, provides a nice mix of benefits that we only need to slightly go outside of to round out the build, with the offense obviously coming from the main bone damage skills like Bone Spear for direct fire and piercing with a reasonable mana cost for the main workhorse, Bone Spirit finally getting back to its role as a boss hunter at higher mana costs ever since the 2.4 balance changes, and Teeth, yes, Teeth, being your shotgun blast to deal with swarms of small enemies like flayers, fetishes, and imps. Though on the Teeth front, remember, an enemy can only ever be hit by one tooth, so don't waste it on single targets unless you want to meme it up and kill Bale as a dentist. By getting these, we also pick up another cornerstone offensive skill that's good for tougher crowds like cows, venom lords, etc., and that is Corpse Explosion. In the endgame, plus skills are usually enough to give it a good radius for most of these uses, but there are variants that skip out on Teeth, which makes their first kill slower due to synergy drops, but speeds up the crowd clear due to the splash from Corpse Explosion hitting a wider area. On the defensive front, our Bone skills also get benefits from two key skills, Bone Wall and Bone Prison. They not only boost the damage you deal with your Spear, Spirit, and Teeth, but they also boost the damage absorb available with Bone Armor, which is one of the key tools for why this is so durable, well, outside of the fact that Bone Wall and Bone Prison are exceptionally good at locking enemies into specific spots to control them. I personally prefer Bone Wall since it doesn't need a target, and it can bait enemies in from further away, but Bone Prison is just as good if you prefer using these only when enemies are near already, and it is actually a bit more controller friendly. Now, outside of these skills, we have our summons, which is a simple clay golem for its slow effect, which we also want a point in golem mastery and summon resist for, so they survive a bit longer, and the slow is extremely handy when combined with Holy Freeze Mercenary or Decrepify to set enemies on a crawl, since the slow also applies anytime the golem is struck by a melee attack, not just when it hits. And we of course also want to dip over to our curses to pick up your choice of, well, preferred curses, the most popular being Amplify Damage or Decrepify for use with Corpse Explosion since they reduce physical resistance, with Amplify Damage dropping it by 100 while Decrepify only drops it by 50, but Decrepify also provides slowing and weakening effects, which is exceptionally handy while going through solo self-found, so don't kind of pass it up unless you know for sure you have endgame gear. And if you do find yourself needing more control effects, the left side of the curse tree is also handy with Dim Vision, Confuse, and Attract providing somewhat different options for the tricks you want to pull, which you can find out more about by clicking on the card in the top right since it is one of the more involved skills in the game. Now, as far as the number of points in any of these curses or summons goes, that's straight up 1 point each. Do not waste more in them, since you will need the vast majority of your points in the 5 core skills of the build. Bone Spear and Bone Wall being my primary picks for obvious reasons, Bone Spirit and Bone Prison being my secondary picks, and then Teeth being the last one I hard dump into, though I usually do have a few points into it before that, just to tide me over until I get to Bone Spear, since you do need to kill early on if you are not being rushed. And that's also pretty much the order I like investing in the skills, whether I'm going through without skill resets or if I'm changing over to this in hell difficulty after playing around with a less orthodox Necromancer build, just to have something to push me that last little bit of the way out of laziness. Now, in terms of equipment progression through the difficulties, normal is going to be the usual stealth armor and lore if you can get it in the helmet, though the Bone Necromancer should also be on the lookout for something else in normal. wands and necro heads. Since we focus on level 18 skills, we can get heads and wands with +3 bone spear and a smattering of other useful skills, the most desirable being something like 3 bone spear, corpse explosion, and decrepify, though you can't really shop for that. You do want to pick up most white wands that can get 2 sockets for that, and the same for necrom heads. Now, what you can shop for is a +3 Bone Spear wand from Drognin in normal difficulty. A non-magical wand at that, which Act 2 normal Drognin will do due to limitations on his item spawn abilities, which means if you're really hurting for gear, he's a good source for the base we can use even in absolutely endgame gear. Though that said, we won't be able to make the items we're hoping for with these bases until Nightmare whenever we start seeing the higher rune drops. So if you don't get lucky with the base items, they do come online at about the same time as Spirit Swords, so you could just take it easy and make one of those from a broadsword if you don't feel like farming. But if you did get them, the runes we're looking for are Dole and Io for a white wand, and yes, that's Io, not low, don't mix it up. It has faster cast, plus skills we want, and extra boost to the Bone Spear on top of that. It can outdamage even Heart of the Oak, though Heart is better defensively, so it's kind of a here or there choice in the endgame gear. And if you're going with the shield, you want to keep an eye out for Eth and Lum if you happen to find a good +3 Bone Spear Necro head while playing through the game. And heck, it's a good choice even if you just found a 2-socket necro head you like the look of, since Splendor, the rune word it makes, is just a good caster rune word shield until you can get the strength for a spirit shield in hell difficulty, or until you get one of the necro uniques. Hell, with the right plus skills, it can even rival them if you're not going for the 9-frame casting breakpoint. In hell difficulty, you guessed it, Spirit Shield is your main go-to goal, and it will be your main go-to goal if you're going for the 125% faster cast endgame gear too. Though, for solo self-found, you'll usually be aiming more for either the 48% or 75% breakpoints, which you can get most of from mixing and matching white with things like Splendor or Spirit, or even just running dual Spirit for easier to find runes. And since it will come up in the comments, the Necromancer armor Bone is pretty handy as well, though it does not quite reach the point of display due to costing 2 runes, making it fit in that awkward space between endgame gear and progression gear. Though if you do find 2 runes, drop a soul, and into 3-socket armor and you'll thank me later. Now, speaking of endgame gear, there's 2 schools of thought, since barring specific GG stuff like once-in-a-lifetime rares or necro circlets of the Magus, you pretty much have 2 choices. Max faster cast for better spamming and teleport at 125%, or more damage per cast at more reasonable item bases, but losing a frame each cast at a 75% target. Personally, I usually just go for the 75%, since I don't have any of those circlets sadly, in spite of gambling my butt off several times over the years, which means I go with the white wand option for higher level spear and homunculus for extremely good resist, especially with an rune in it like we have here. Though this does require a decent caster amulet, which if you don't have, you're going to instead dip over to using either a Splendor or a Spirit to make up the speed gap. If you want the faster cast breakpoint, you're generally going to want to go instead for a setup more like Heart of the Oak for better faster cast, plus skills and resist, as well as a Spirit for again plus skills and faster cast. Though you can get pretty close with Dark Force spawn, but good luck getting high rolls on the randomized plus skills. Obviously, if you do have a faster cast circlet or a really good caster amulet like the one we're using here, you can be a bit less picky. But if you don't have a good caster amulet, you'll usually end up going with Mara's or a generic +2 necro amulet instead, and rely on your weapon and other gear to cover the gaps in faster cast, since you really don't want to drop below that 75% goal whenever you're talking about endgame play. Even though for solo self-found, 48% would be acceptable, it just doesn't cut it for the actual endgame play. Helmet-wise, since I don't have that circlet I was talking about to beat it out, it's straight for the traditional Harlequin crest, plus skills and magic find. Can't really beat it for something quick and easy that you can just throw on. Though plus skill circlets can quickly beat this out if you even have a little bit of decent luck. On the armor, this is actually a build I generally do like Enigma on, even whenever just playing normally, since we make heavy use of Bone Wall or Prison for enemy control, which means teleport to move past these efficiently is a lot better than waiting for them to expire. For solo self-found, you just do this with a teleport staff. But there are some other tricks you could do to force them to expire, but they're not quite as good. Now, if you don't use these, you can get away with Bone or Chains of Honor, plus skills are just super important for this build. And in a pinch, you could use Skin of Viper Magi if you want to get some of those faster cast breakpoints. Belts and rings should be pretty obvious as they are with any caster, really. Arachnid's Mesh for faster casts and plus skills, you pretty much won't find any casters without it. And I went with Dual Stones of Jordan, though this is another place you could make up faster casts if you need to with faster cast rings. On the boots, there's really nothing too amazing to pick from. You can go with Mana from Silkweaves, Life with Sandstorm Tracks, but since we already had a decent amount of Magic Find, why not just double down on it and go with War Travelers, since in for a penny, in for a pound. And none of the things here really give us any major boosts, so might as well get some extra Magic Find. Flop on over to the gloves and you'll see the last of our faster cast in the form of Trangul's Claws. Great gloves in general for casters, though an easier to find alternative is Mage Fist. Both work just fine. Claws just have plus curses and cold resist, which don't help us a ton, but are nice to have nonetheless. As far as the Mercenary, Insight Mercenary is about all you really need to care about. If you go Act 1, I generally prefer Fire, but this works just fine with the ice outside of places like cows, where you really want the corpses for explosions. Though it's nice to have them in other places, it's just not quite as important. However, if you go Act 2 Mercenary with Insight, you'll want to consider either Prayer for double healing for any elemental damage you take, or you'll want Holy Freeze to slow enemies down. Though while it doesn't shatter near as much as the Act 1 Mercenary with freeze effects, it will still eat a couple corpses. But it's not quite as tragedy level as some people will make it out to be. This build can be played with high APM, which is actions per minute, kind of real-time strategy talk there, or it can be played pretty laid back while watching a movie, which is what I did to gather the background footage you're looking at right now, and can watch in its full lazy glory over on the side channel. Whichever you prefer, it's just a solid, reliable, and budget-friendly build, even at the high end compared to other endgame builds, with only Enigma really being a bankbuster. So, do you prefer only playing S-tier builds like the Sorceress build on screen now, or are you one who prefers more experimental or just chill stuff that is just plain fun to play? Mention it down below, and as always, thanks again for any likes, subs, or even memberships you drop to help keep the channel alive.